Hi everyone. I wanted to take a couple of minutes to go over some of the questions that I've been asked, and I noticed that Claudine sent me an email and sent me some good stuff there, so I asked her to post the questions for me so that I could make a video for you today. And then I also see that some of the questions were answered here, but I wanted to go over that and then talk to you a little bit more about where you should be in the inquiry process here, and what to do if you're stuck and that kind of stuff. And then as I said in my post today, I've extended the deadline, and then next week I'll give you a couple of supplemental things, but I won't give you new content. We'll start the next unit a week from now, so I'm not too worried about throwing the extra 4 days in to give you a little bit more time to understand how this goes, because we're going to go through the process again. So it's good to take some time now. So anyways, enough with the talking, and let me get into this. So here are some of the questions that I'm going to start with. We're unable to see which groups we're in. So here's the solution to that, and you'll notice that it's posted in the help thread down here. So if you go to the inquiry discussion, you start a new thread. As soon as you press it, it'll say posting to whatever group. So the only way that you can find out your groups, I think, is to actually go in and make a post. So that's why I suggested you go and sort of introduce yourselves, and you can kind of talk a little bit there. So your post is like sitting, your groups are like sitting in a group of 3 in a classroom. Now, obviously, I'm going to read them, so maybe leave out what you're going to wear to prom, but you know, you can go through and talk about that and talk about the things that you're worried about, and then post and make some suggestions there. And I also, if you take a look at that discussion, I give you some suggestions of things you might take a look at. So that's the answer to the first question. You can only find your groups by going to that link and by posting something in that link. And then the next time I'm going to have you pick your groups, but this time they were just auto-generated because I didn't want to add that stress of trying to figure out who you wanted to work with. All right, second one, for the Indigenous Community Survey, is it the groups we chose for our inquiry project, the ones outside Canada and the US? Yes. And all we're trying to do is to locate them on a map, because we're going to keep building on that map so that by the end, our map will show not just where you are from and your traditional territory, but also some of the areas where we have looked at the different Indigenous groups. What is the inquiry you talk about in our reflection? Is it the Indigenous group we chose? Yes. So the reflection is going to be, it's due a couple of days before your final product is due, just because I think you've probably by that point done some of the thinking behind it. You can kind of talk about what it is that you did well and some of the stuff you struggled with. So that when I talk about the inquiry project, we're talking about this Indigenous group that you chose outside of Canada and the US. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what you're looking for there. So I'll get to that in a minute. For the final product about our group outside Canada and the US, is there any questions to guide our research? So I think I added for you a few things that you might think about, and I'm going to pause this video and go to another screen in a few minutes, and I'll answer that question. How are you presenting your findings to the class? And down below here, I also noticed that we have another question. I don't want to be too specific about that. You can present it in whichever way you think you can present your information the best. Because this is a social studies class, if you have a research paper and you're really strong with those, you do that. That's great with me. I'm an English teacher by trade. I've done a master's in education with a focus on Indigenous studies, so I have done research papers. I can give you good suggestions on those if you know that's the area you're going into. So you're welcome to do that. But you don't have to go that route. You could do a PowerPoint presentation, a slideshow. The same thing as you presented things before. You could do a Tumblr. You could do focus on images and words. You could, I think maybe writing a song right now might be tricky, but if that's what you're really great at, like I want you to choose a way that you are interested in either doing or learning, or an area you really like. Like if you are a blogger and you want to do a blog or a vlog or something like that, that's good with me. There are things that you're good at that I probably don't even know about. So all of those ways are fine. I want your presentation to be organized and easy to follow, but I don't have any, if you take a look at the rubric, I'm not looking for a certain number of slides. I'm not looking for, you know, any specifics about the fact that it has to be a video or there has to be a voiceover. The presentation is totally up to you. As long as you find a good way to meet those requirements in the rubric, I'd like you to present it in whatever way you like. All right, so I think it's important for you to have a chance to sort of show what you know in the best way that you know. So I am now going to pause for a minute, get to another screen, and we'll come back and look at the requirements. Okay, we're back. I am now on the content page, and it's unrelated, but I think I've sort of figured out the content now in a way that it isn't a total catastrophe, because it was just a real mess there. And I'm sorry, because this is the first time I've used this particular setup in D2L, and it did not react like the old setup, but I think I've got it. So you can collapse everything, and all of the activities are here under the unit, and then I'm going to expand them. If I want to see them all, I'm going to collapse them again, and then I'm going to go down to Introduction to Inquiry. We're going to look here first. So if we take a look at the content for the actual inquiry, I give you a little video so that you'll learn a little bit about inquiry, and then here's the question: how does the common Indigenous worldview connect to the identity of different Indigenous groups outside of Canada and the United States? So this is the question that your inquiry is answering, if you will. This is the guiding principle. Sometimes it's called an umbrella question, and if you can picture an umbrella, it's because an umbrella sort of covers over the top of everything. So think of sitting out on the porch or the veranda, the lanai, we call it sitting under the pergola at my house because we have a pergola, whatever you call it, and having like an umbrella over top of you so that the sun doesn't, mess up your dinner. That's the umbrella question. So this is what you're trying to answer in your inquiry. So you have to pick an Indigenous group outside of Canada and the United States. And then you're going to take a look at Indigenous worldview and identity. And Indigenous worldview and identity are concepts that we've talked about in the beginning of the unit. So basically, you are taking all of the stuff that you have learned from that and sort of applying it to a group of your choice. Now, I know it's hard because some of you might not necessarily have an idea of what group you wanted to choose, and others of you, we just had a trip with students in our board, and some of the students went to Kenya, and so one of the students in our class was there, and obviously she has a connection to that group because she's traveled all the way to another continent to meet with them. So she is working on that group. You might have a connection in your past to an Indigenous group, or you might have seen a movie that you're interested in, however it was that you chose your group. So this is the basis of your inquiry. And your final inquiry, an inquiry is basically questioning. So your final research into this question, it can be presented in any way you want. So you're going to take a look at how to answer that question. And in the end, you might, you'll talk about identity and spirituality, culture, connect them to elements of the common worldview. You're going to obviously have to tell your audience a little bit about the group as well, so that we can get an idea of who they are, where they're from, talk a little bit about how, what their identity is, all that kind of stuff. So that is the focus of these two activities. So I'm going to pause us, and then we're going to move on to the next activity. Okay, and we're back, and now let's take a look at this week's activity. So I gave you learning goals and success criteria to give you an idea of what it was that you're meant to learn from this section, and then I talked a little bit about it in my last video. About how to use your rubric and then learning goals and success criteria. So let's take a look at the activity content for this unit, which isn't huge, because again, it's sort of about you kind of looking into those questions and then finding some interesting things and answering that kind of stuff. The first thing is you're going to locate your Indigenous community, and I've already talked about that map. And then you should have, or will very shortly, once you look at this video, be doing some research to answer those questions. And so one of the things is that you need to make sure that your sources of your information for this or any other academic research you do, that they're actually valid and useful. So I've given you some of these different ways of looking at your, evaluating whether your sources are any good. So I'm sure your teachers have said things like, oh, don't use Wikipedia. Wikipedia is actually not a bad place to start, but really in Wikipedia, what that does is lead you to the links in Wikipedia that bring you to the original sources. So Wikipedia is not a bad place to look up information, but make sure that you use that as a kind of starting point and then dig deeper than that. Then you're going to take a look at the voices that are sort of represented by your research. And so those voices should be authentic. You should be having sources, and it doesn't have to be like spoken word, but the website should have Indigenous people writing for them, or the videos that you see should be Indigenous people speaking of themselves. Now that doesn't mean it has to be only someone who's living right now in the Indigenous community in Chile or wherever it was that you chose, but that it's not a whole bunch of white researchers talking to you about the group. That's where voices start to get tricky. Then you take a look at your content. Is it interesting? Is it extensive? Is it rich? So that means like you don't just give me a surface thing where you list like 3 different worldviews and then 2 things that go with it. That you actually start to build your presentation, flesh it out. I'm using all kinds of different metaphors and idioms to talk about this, but that you actually make it something like, I don't just want it a piece of dry toast, right? I want a nice juicy sandwich. And then your presentation, it doesn't matter to me how you present it, but does it convey your message? Is it polished? Like, have you worked on it so that whatever it is you have chosen as your vehicle for showing me what you've learned, that it does what you want it to do? All right, and now you kind of go to the idea of your triad groups. And I want you to use the rubric. I want you to take a look at the success criteria and learning goals. I want you to think back to the things you've learned about worldview, Indigenous worldview, and that commonality, what you've learned about identity, what you've learned a bit about culture, maybe naming, go back and find the things from the course so far. This is what makes this difficult, is that instead of me giving you a test where you have 10 questions and you have to slot in the right answers, I want you to take what you've learned and use this as an opportunity to show me what you've learned. That does not mean that you have to cover every single point. What that means is that you use your brain, that you use your inquiry, that you use your critical thinking, and you put together the things that you think are most important to conveying an answer to that question about how the common worldview connects to identity in this Indigenous group. Here's this little video I made about using the rubric, which I think is very useful. So let's go down to the final product. You pick an Indigenous group, you learn about their identity, then you connect this to worldview, and then you tell us about it. That's what is so frustrating about inquiry, is that instead of me giving you a nice tight framework, I want you to go out there into the scary sort of academic world and try to put something together. Now, I've said this before, and I'll promise you again, if you totally mess this up and you put it through the peer process and everybody thinks it's okay, and then I'm supremely disappointed with it because I think you've missed something or you missed the point, you can always resubmit it. So this is our first inquiry, and this is the first time you're handing something in. So the final sort of feedback will be from me, but that doesn't mean that that is your final feedback. That means that you can then go back and add and change it and then hand it in again. So don't be scared. Now, I don't have an exemplar for you, and partially that's because this is the first time I've taught this online, and partially because even exemplars, I think, tie you in too much to what it should be and cut off kind of the cool ideas you can come up with when you're thinking in a wider way and a little bit under pressure. So part of inquiry is that pressure to, say it, do it well, come up with what you need. The final thing is the reflection. And this is where I've given you some questions for this, because I think sometimes reflecting on things can be a bit difficult as you're a student. So I've given you those questions, and I'd like you to present those to me somehow. You can record your answers if you don't want to write them out. You can do them in point form. You can write me a journal entry. You can write me a series of letters. You can videotape yourself in your yard. However you want to present this, as long as you have given me thoughtful answers to these questions, that's what I'm looking for. So here's the tricky part, and this is why it's hard, and this is hard also in a class. But your goal is to try to help me understand what you now know. So this is sort of like, I don't know, the playoffs of the unit. So remember, this is your question. How does the common Indigenous worldview connect to the identity of different Indigenous groups? So you pick a group. You think about what the common Indigenous worldview is, and then you pick what areas of that apply to your group. You think about identity and go back and look at the different ways that identity is created. And then you try to connect them. It's difficult because I've given you the worldview, and then I've given you some examples of it. I've given you, a definition of identity and talked about some of the things that are involved in that. And then I've sent you off into a boat, into the great ocean in a storm, and said, okay, figure it out. And I know I'm doing that to you. I'm doing it on purpose. It will be satisfying in the end, but it's tough now. But know that that's part of this, that struggle is part of the inquiry. And by the time we come to the end of the course, you're going to be really comfortable with this, because you've got a life raft, you've got a life preserver, but you do not have all the rules. And I also really believe, and there's lots of research behind it, that this is going to make you better thinkers in university too. So stick with the struggle a little bit. And then if you have any other questions, please feel free to let me know what those are. All right, I'm going to pause one more time. All right, here's the last bit. So I think that I actually planned it so that the inquiry stuff would come during some of these 4-day weeks and after the break, because I know there's not a whole lot in these times. So after talking to some students in the hallway here at Holy Names, some emails from some of you, that sort of thing, I've decided that I want to give you a little bit more time to work on this. So next week I will have a little bit more content, but not a ton. And next week is when you're going to pull this all together. So what I've done is I've changed the dates, I changed the checklist and the content, and also if you take a look at your submission folders, I've changed the due dates. So some of you have submitted already. If that's the case, and you want to, and you sort of have a grip on this, that's good. If you feel like by what I've said and what has come up with the discussion that you want to change your inquiry, then go ahead and resubmit it before the deadline. It's no big deal. But you'll see that I've changed these, and then if you go to the actual checklist and the content, you'll see that I've also given you till next week to do your triad discussions. So I hope this helps, and I know it's hard because I don't want to answer, like I'm being deliberately troublesome here, because I don't want to answer your questions too specifically, because I don't want to stifle your inquiry. If you have any other specific questions, feel free to put them out there. And next week, once you've done your triads, I'll kind of pop in there, and you'll notice I don't say much in the discussions because I also don't want to stifle those, but I will pop into your triads and take a look at things, and I might be able to clarify things there. So if you have questions for me about your specific work, put them in your triad groups, because I'm a member of all of those, and then I'll go in, and like I would sit down with your group at a table, I'll kind of pop into your discussion. So I'll start doing that Monday and Tuesday of next week. Okay, so I will see you soon. If you need anything else or have any other questions, you just post them.